The files on Ethel Hornbeck's desk were arranged the way she arranged everything in her life, by priority, by threat level, by what could be eliminated. The apartment was silent save for the scratch of her pen and the low hum of rain beginning to press itself against the window. 11 years of careful living had earned her this quiet. She had surgically removed every variable she couldn't control, every person who had ever cost her more than they gave. The math was simple. It always was. She uncapped a second pen. The first clause of the Denton acquisition needed rewording, passive language disguised as confidence. She crossed it out. Hornbeck Consulting does not hedge. It commits. Then the buzzer sounded. She didn't move immediately. Unknown visitors were triaged the same way bad contracts were, with patience, and then with dismissal. But the buzzer came again, longer this time, almost apologetic in its persistence. She crossed to the intercom. The face on the small monitor was gaunt, rain-flattened, older than she remembered. But the jaw was the same. The way he angled his chin slightly downward, not in shame, she now knew, but in calculation, was exactly the same. Raymond Cox. She should have walked back to her desk. Should have let the silence answer for her. Instead, her finger hovered over the intercom button for 3 full seconds before she pressed it. "You have 2 minutes," she said. That was her first mistake. Not letting him in, she hadn't done that yet. The mistake was the 2 minutes. It told him everything he needed to know. 2 minutes became 5. 5 became the length of time it took Raymond to say her name twice through the intercom static, Ethel the first time, a statement, and Ethel the second time, something closer to a wound. And for her hand to find the door release before her mind had formally approved the decision. She stood in the doorway of her apartment and looked at him. Really looked. The coat he wore was a size too large and soaked through entirely, the kind of wet that doesn't happen from a short walk but from a long one, or from standing outside somewhere with nowhere to go. His shoes were wrong for the weather. His eyes, when they finally met hers, had the particular exhaustion of a man who had stopped performing dignity and was now simply surviving without it. She had spent 11 years building something Raymond Cox could not touch. The consulting practice. The apartment on the 14th floor with its clean sight lines and its silence. The version of herself that did not flinch, did not second-guess, did not open doors for people who had already proven what they did with open doors. She had paid for that peace in increments, missed dinners, severed friendships, 2 paragraphs in a lawyer's letter that formally ended the last thing she had let herself feel for this man. It had been worth it. Every single invoice of it. "I have nowhere else to go," Raymond said. Water dripped from his jaw onto her threshold. "I know I don't deserve to be here. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm just asking for tonight." Ethel said nothing for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. That was her first mistake. The 2 minutes had been arrogance. This was mercy. And mercy, she would learn, was the more expensive of the two. She had not always been this way. There was a version of Ethel Hornbeck who laughed too easily, who trusted the way children trust, completely, without auditing the fine print. That version had grown up in her father's shadow, watching Harold Hornbeck shake hands across mahogany tables and call it legacy. She had believed in legacy once. In the idea that some people were simply good, and that goodness, like property, could be inherited. Raymond had been the one to correct that belief. He had come into her father's firm at 29, sharp-edged and hungry in a way Harold mistook for ambition and Ethel mistook for something warmer. For 3 years he had been the most convincing person in every room, attentive, strategic, unervingly perceptive. Ethel had confused being seen by someone with being safe with them. It was the most expensive mistake of her life. When the accounts were audited and the documents surfaced, Raymond was already gone. So was a decade's worth of her father's land holdings, quietly restructured through paperwork Harold had signed without reading and Ethel had never thought to question. Harold died 2 years later, not from the loss, he would have insisted, though the loss had taken something from his posture that never returned. Ethel rebuilt. Methodically. With the precision of someone who had learned that sentiment was a liability and trust was simply risk without sufficient collateral. She had been so certain she was finished grieving the lesson. Then Raymond knocked on her door, and she stepped aside, and the lesson began again. He didn't ask for much at first. That was the thing about Raymond. He had always understood that the opening move was never the real move. He sat at her kitchen table with a mug of tea she hadn't offered, but had made anyway, and he talked. Quietly, carefully, the way a man speaks when he's rehearsed humility long enough that it starts to resemble the real thing. He had lost the consulting work in Atlanta. Then the apartment. Then, with a pause waited enough to feel genuine, the relationship he'd built after leaving a woman named Carla, 2 years, gone because he couldn't, as he put it, stop carrying what he'd done to you. Ethel said nothing. She had learned that silence was a better interrogation tool than questions. But then he said something that shifted the air in the room. He mentioned the lemon tree. The one in her father's back garden that Harold used to joke was the only honest thing on the property, gave you exactly what it promised, nothing more. Raymond had been there the summer it stopped bearing fruit, and he had stood beside Harold in comfortable silence while the old man tried to diagnose it. It was such a small detail. So specific. So entirely unnecessary to manufacture. And that was precisely why it worked. Ethel felt the hairline fracture before she could stop it, that dangerous softening that came not from believing Raymond had changed, but from remembering who they had both been before he hadn't. She refilled his mug without being asked. She told herself it was temporary. A word she had always trusted because it came with a built-in expiration date. The guest room was at the far end of the apartment, separated from her study by a hallway and a door with a lock she had never previously felt the need to use. She felt it now, a faint, almost embarrassing instinct, and ignored it. Raymond was down the hall, not inside her defenses. There was a difference. She was certain of it. The first thing she noticed was the Denton file. She kept her active files in a specific order, not alphabetical, not chronological, but by the internal logic of how her mind moved through problems. She had developed the system over a decade, and it had never failed her. On the third morning of Raymond's stay, the Denton file was second from the left instead of fourth. Not missing. Not opened, as far as she could tell. Simply moved, by the precise distance of 2 slots. She stood at her desk for a long moment, reconstructing the previous evening. She had been tired. She had poured a second glass of wine. It was possible, not likely, but possible, that she had misplaced it herself. She chose possible. Then there was the way he looked at the study door sometimes. Not with curiosity. With the specific patience of someone who had already decided they would eventually be on the other side of it and saw no reason to rush. She told herself it was paranoia. She was right that it was something. She was wrong about which one. It arrived on a Tuesday, which felt deliberately ordinary. Raymond came into the kitchen while Ethel was reviewing contracts, a folded document in his hand and something carefully constructed on his face, not quite hope, because hope would have been too easy to dismiss. It was closer to reluctance, the expression of a man who hated needing anything but had run out of alternatives. A logistics firm in Cincinnati, he explained. Entry-level operations management. The kind of role that asked nothing of a person's history, only their availability and their word. The hiring manager had agreed to consider him, but required a character reference from someone who had known him professionally. He had no one else, he said. He understood if she refused. He set the form on the table and stepped back from it, as though proximity might seem like pressure. Ethel looked at it. 2 pages, standard formatting, a signature line at the bottom above her printed name. She recognized the language, bland, bureaucratic, the grammar of legitimacy. She had signed 1,000 documents in her career and processed each one with the same clinical detachment she applied to everything. But this was different, and she knew it, and that knowing should have made her slow down. Instead, it made her pick up the pen faster. Because signing felt like proof, Proof that she was not the kind of woman who hoarded her second chances, that she had not let Raymond Cox make her smaller than she was. She signed her name in one clean stroke. The surge of moral pride lasted exactly 4 days. She woke at 2 a.m. to the specific silence of a space that should not have been silent. Ethel had lived alone long enough to know the acoustics of her apartment the way a musician knows an instrument. Every ambient hum, every settling groan of the building, the particular quality of quiet that meant nothing was wrong. This was not that quiet. This was the quiet of held breath, of careful movement mistaken for stillness. She lay in the dark for a moment, cataloging the refrigerator's low cycle. Rain, still, against the far window. And beneath both nothing. No footsteps from the guest room. No sound of a body turning in sleep. She found her robe and moved into the hallway without turning on the lights. The study door was ajar by perhaps 4 inches. She had closed it fully before bed. She always did, the same way she always locked the filing cabinet and set the Denton file forth from the left. These were not habits. They were a system. And systems, when broken, meant something. Then she smelled it. Old paper has a particular scent when it's disturbed after long stillness, acrid and faintly sweet, like something preserved being exposed to air for the first time in years. It was the smell of her father's desk, the antique one she had moved from Harold's study after he died. She had kept it closed. She had never given Raymond reason to open it. She pushed the door. The desk was dismantled. And Raymond was kneeling before it with the focused calm of a man who had been waiting a very long time to be exactly where he was. He didn't startle. That was the first thing she registered. A guilty man flinches. Raymond simply looked up from the desk's dismantled interior, a sheaf of yellowed documents in his hand, and met her eyes with the particular steadiness of someone who had already rehearsed this moment and found it satisfactory. Ethel. Same as the intercom. A statement, not an apology. She didn't move from the doorway. Her mind was already working, inventorying the scene, cross-referencing, building the case before the verdict arrived. The desk panels were removed with surgical precision. No splintering, no forced entry. He had known exactly where to look, which meant he had known what was there long before tonight. The document, she said. Not a question. Raymond set the land deeds on the desk's exposed surface with the quiet ceremony of a man completing something long overdue. The Cincinnati firm doesn't exist, he said. The form you signed was a legal waiver. Voluntary transfer of interest in your father's estate, specifically the Alderman County holdings. Witnessed, dated, and now executed. The Alderman County holdings. 43 acres of land her father had believed were lost in a bad deal 20 years ago. Land she had never known to grieve, because Harold had never told her it existed. Raymond had known. Raymond had always known. The warmth she had allowed herself, the lemon tree, the refilled mug, the clean stroke of her signature, curdled into something cold and precise. She looked at him across her father's ruined desk and understood, finally, that the begging had never been the point. She had been the point. She had always been the point. He told her everything. That was the part she hadn't anticipated. Not out of remorse, she understood that immediately. Raymond explained himself the way a craftsman describes a finished piece, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for an audience worthy of the work. He set the documents down and leaned against the wall and simply talked, and she let him, because information was still information regardless of who was delivering it and why. He had tracked her career from a distance for 6 years. Read every profile, every industry feature, every quoted soundbite from conferences she had keynote. He had built a precise model of how she thought, not her opinions, but her architecture. The internal logic she used to navigate people and decisions. He knew she would never respond to overt vulnerability, so he had manufactured reluctant vulnerability instead. He knew the savior reflex she despised in others was the one she had buried deepest in herself, which made it the most reliable lever to pull. The lemon tree, she said quietly. He nodded. a detail specific enough to feel unscripted. He had been counting on her to interpret specificity as sincerity. She had. Ethel stood very still while he spoke. She was doing what she always did with information she didn't like, not feeling it yet, just filing it, building the complete picture before allowing herself any response. What Raymond had failed to account for, she was realizing, was that being studied was not the same as being known. He had mapped her vulnerabilities. He had missed her architecture entirely. He finished speaking and the room settled into the kind of silence that follows a confession, except Raymond hadn't confessed anything. He had presented. There was a difference, and the difference mattered, and Ethel stood with it for a long moment before she understood what was actually sitting in her chest. It wasn't betrayal. She had been betrayed before and knew its specific weight, hot, disorienting, personal. This was something colder and more precise. It was recognition. She had let Raymond in not because she believed he had changed, but because she believed, somewhere beneath 11 years of careful architecture, that her willingness to extend mercy was proof of her own evolution. That she had grown beyond the woman who closed doors and called it wisdom. That letting him across her threshold was an act of strength rather than what it actually was, an act of ego dressed in the language of grace. She had not been saving Raymond Cox. She had been decorating her own self-image with him. He had known that. He had built his entire strategy on it, on the fact that a woman who prided herself on seeing through people would be most blind to the story she was telling herself about her own generosity. The mercy she had extended was never really about him. And the arrogance she was only now confronting had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with the quiet, unexamined belief that her judgment was a gift she was bestowing rather than a system that could be reverse-engineered. Raymond had not beaten her instincts. He had beaten her pride. And pride, she knew, was the more dangerous of the two. She asked him for a copy of the document. Raymond blinked, the first unscripted response she had seen from him all evening, and something flickered behind his eyes. Not suspicion. Curiosity. He had studied her long enough to know she didn't make requests without architecture behind them, but he had also just delivered what he believed was a checkmate, and checkmate had a way of making even careful men comfortable. He handed her the waiver. Ethel read it the way she read every contract, not for what it said, but for what it assumed. The language was clean, the structure competent. Whoever had drafted it knew enough to be dangerous, but not enough to be thorough. She reached the third clause on the second page and stopped. The transfer was contingent on her signature and notarized verification of her identity as Harold Hornbeck's sole legal heir. A standard requirement for estate documents of this classification, one that Raymond had apparently considered a formality. It was not a formality, because Harold Hornbeck, in the final year of his life, had quietly amended his estate filing to include a secondary trustee, a procedural decision made on the advice of his attorney, recorded in a county document Raymond had never thought to pull because he had been too focused on studying Ethel to study Harold. The amendment required dual authorization. Her signature alone was legally insufficient. Ethel set the document down on the ruins of her father's desk. "You spent 6 years learning how I think," she said quietly. "You forgot that he taught me." She picked up her phone and called her lawyer.